Minot Beach. Probably the best view of Minot is from the air. In total, there aren't more than 3 dozen cottages in Minot, and most of them in the past 90 years have been wrecked by storms and rebuilt over and over again. Fortunately, Minot has been a subject of postcards for many years. In looking at these old cards, we can get a flavor of Minot of 70 or 80 years ago. This is a view from the hill just inside the first gate of the Glades. Here is the view from the hill inside the second gate of the Glades. Most of these old cards belong to Helen and date back to the 1920s. The next view of Minot will be commented on by Sister Barbara Healy and Minion Prey.
Garage looks like that.
You're right. Oh, that's wonderful.
It's not the present one, is it? It's the old
No,
one.
that's the old one.
These are old postcards he took.
This is not a postcard. It's a picture of Albert Lewis's cottage. Albert, a year-round resident, came to Minot in the early 1890s and lived here until he died in 1954. One may have a little trouble in recognizing the main street of Minot in the early 1920s. It must have been winter. There are so few people around. This was the original Minot post office. Later it was owned by Nellie Size and then wrecked in the storm of 1978. I would say this building and the apartment building that replaced it are good examples of Minot Beach architecture. Pulpit Rock really needs no identification. It stands as a monument to the quarrying operation which went on here over 100 years ago. There must have been an impressive ledge here before the granite was removed. The Glades Club of 70 or 80 years ago. Minot Beach and the Glades Club never did mingle very much. Anyone familiar with the Glades knows that the cupola on the right-hand building blew down in the 1920s or even before. This area is really not Minot, but North Scituate Beach from the era of World War I. The bathers are probably from the Cliff Hotel seen in the upper left. How did Minot Beach get its name? The most reliable account is that it was named after George Minot, a Boston merchant whose ship got wrecked on the ledge offshore sometime prior to the Revolutionary War, or about 1757. The original Minot light on the left was built after that and was destroyed about 1854. It was replaced by the current lighthouse on the right. Summer visitors to Minot Beach of 100 years ago came from all around Boston. Many came by train to this original railroad station in North Scituate and then by horse and buggy to Minot. The original station was replaced shortly after the turn of the century with this modern station. At its peak, there were 14 trains a day. The last passenger train left North Scituate in 1958. Needless to say, there have been many shipwrecks in the vicinity of Minot, such as this schooner at Sandhills on December 26, 1909. There are some old Scituate residents who still remember the wreck of the pirate boat Columbia. The deckhouse from the Columbia became a tea room for the Cliff Hotel. The crews of the wrecked vessels were often saved by the men of the lifeboat station at Surfside. These men patrolled the beach night and day, every day of the year. The U.S. Life-Saving Service was later replaced by the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard station was shut down after World War II, and the building was converted to a private home. The lifeboats were propelled entirely by oars. Not bad as a summer job, but a little uncomfortable in the winter. The Healys first came to Minot as summer visitors in 1932 and 1933. We stayed at the Nomad and Damon cottages. This picture from the top shows Catherine, Mom, Anna, Mary and Jenny, and then on the bottom Dick, Babs, and Jack. Minion remembers.
Little Babber. Oh, I remember little Babber every night. I used to run up there after I got the dishes done. I lived over here for the summer. And Paula, Anna would put her to bed with a glass of milk and a cupcake or something. And Mr. and Mrs. Healy every night walked up to the end of the glades.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
One of the many changes Minot has undergone over the past 20 or 30 years is the disappearance of cottage names. Back 40 or 50 years ago, most cottages had names painted on signs mounted in front of the house. Names like the Woodbine, the Ivy, the Breakers, the Linger Longer, the Auto Rest, and the Minion. One of the few remaining cottages proudly proclaiming its name is, of course, the Sunnyside.
What do you think of the new Suzanne's that's going up?
She can't get over it.
Peg's new house? Looks like a new house in the garage now.
Yeah? Oh, the rocks are lovely.
Aren't they nice?
Yeah. They really are.
So calm and blue then. You think we're so peaceful.
Right.
Yeah, it looks like a lake, doesn't it?
Sure.
The airplane.
I think I'll hear from Brady tonight. He probably didn't have anything to say last night, so what could he?
Yeah.
I know they didn't give her any tests yesterday because she was too restless.
Uh-huh.
And whatever the tests were, she had to be quiet. Jane told me that.
Oh.
But Jane said there was no bleeding, so that's a good sign, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Well, Rick.
Oh.
One of the questions which fascinates the old-timers of Minot is, what was the beach like 90 or 100 years ago? Did cows actually graze on the beach side of the seawall? Albert Lewis remembers standing at the seawall of Minot in the great storm of 1898. At that time, the seawall, he said, was made of wooden planks. In this 1910 postcard, the dark area on the lower right, when viewed under a magnifying glass, is clearly low shrubs and grass. Here's another postcard from the same era. Most fascinating is the building described in the back of the postcard as a summer camp for the Episcopal Church of Cohasset. Another old postcard from the turn of the century. The sign at the entrance of the glades, there on the left, reads, "Private ground. Strangers are requested not to enter. Automobiles not allowed." Interestingly, the dark area in the center of the road, under a magnifying glass, clearly shows horses' hoofs. The next card is Kirka 1919, was sold by Molly Pryor. Molly Pryor was an outstanding resident at this end of Minot for countless years, until the early 1940s. I don't remember her ever smiling, but that was unimportant to the fact that she ran a candy store 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, and for 12 months a year. The arrow points to what appears to be, under a magnifying glass, a formidable figure of a woman. It can be none other than Molly Pryor. The Healys, after spending the summers of 1932 and 33 in the Nomad and Damon cottages, did not return to Minot for 10 years. In the fall of 1943, John Healy retired from the Glades and at Hannah's direction acquired the Sunnyside cottage. Looking back at the late 1940s and early 50s, the sharpest memories are of northeast storms, broken seawalls, and wrecked cottages. Look closely at the next scene and you will see a rare shot of Albert Lewis leaving the Sunnyside. Hannah Healy pretty much ran the cottage in the early days. Back in the 1940s and 50s, she was still in her 60s and enjoyed life there tremendously. Despite her energy, however, she depended on Joe to repair the driveway after a storm. As the 1950s arrived, Hannah's grandchildren increased in size and number, and she was still young enough to go to the beach with them. Here is just a sample of a few grandchildren gathered with Hannah about 1950. Madge Schuler, alias Madge Doyle, frequently joined Hannah at the beach when the tide was in. Who is that seated there on the beach? She looks so familiar. It would have been nice to have recorded Minion Prey along with Helen and Marie, other Minot old-timers, all of whom made regular but fast trips down to the beach in the 1950s. We can't possibly show shots of all the very young Healy grandchildren who spent time at Minot back in the 1950s. This happens to be the Smith twins and young Jack Healy along with his mother Ann. Other visiting grandchildren to Minot during the 1950s were Judy Green, Candy, Gail, David, Helen Carroll, Evan Healy and Katie Healy, Paula and Barbara Smith, Dick St. Ange, Steve, Bob, Sue, and Greg. Any mention of Minot in the 1950s should include the McDonoughs. Here is young Tom in the 1950s, and a generation later, in 1989. His son Michael is now about the same age Tom was in the 1950s scene with Chris Smith. There were some big changes in Minot during the 1950s. Albert Lewis went to the big clam flats in the sky, Hatch's store disappeared, and Albert Lewis's friend Bill Kinney went flounder fishing for the last time. But some things changed very little, particularly the Sunnyside. As the 1960s and 70s came, many cottages in Minot were winterized, but not the Sunnyside. In the 1980s, new faces appeared in Minot, the great-grandchildren, represented here by Stephen St. Ange, as held by his grandmother, Judy. Michael McDonough pulling Stephen. Unfortunately, the children that came to Minot in the 1980s would find the waters dirtier and the fish far fewer than in the 1950s, and no clamming at all. Among the highlights of the 1980s were the visits by Sister Paula of Fiji. I have a feeling Minot Beach will go on forever. It has survived Yankees, Protestants, Irish Catholics, and the worst storms of the Atlantic. It has even survived the Healys, the Greens, Smiths, and St. Anges. But I don't think we'll ever again see the likes of Molly Pryor, or that grass will ever grow on the other side of the seawall.